We are now going to look at parsing imperfects. And to do that, we need to look at what the Fuller and Choi textbook calls box characteristics. This refers to the following verb features: the prefix consonant, the prefix vowel, R1 doubling, which is mainly confined to Nafal imperfects, the R1 vowel or silent schwa. Often I will say R1 vowel, and that includes the idea that it could be a silent schwa, even though technically a silent schwa is not a vowel. And then finally, R2 doubling, and we see that mainly with the intensive stems. So at this point, once you've looked at the box characteristics, you have usually narrowed down your search to one stem and to a few possible candidate imperfects within that stem. Note what else the prefix consonant can tell you. If it's an aleph, we have a first common singular. If it's a nun, we have a first common plural. If it's a yod, we have third masculine, either singular or plural. And if it's a tav, this includes all the second person forms and third feminine singular. Usually when I see a tav, my default assessment is that I have a second person form, but I hold the possibility in my mind that it might be a third feminine singular, which is identical to a second masculine singular. We have two other characteristics that will help us to parse. If we go in order from right to left, the next characteristic we see after the R2 doubling is the R2 vowel, which we call the theme vowel. The theme vowel is particularly important for weak verbs and for forms in the chart below the imperfect, such as imperatives and infinitives. The last characteristic, and one that we have to know to parse an imperfect, is the imperfect suffix. So with the box characteristics of an imperfect, the theme vowel, and the imperfect suffix, we can parse virtually any imperfect form. So let's look at the box characteristics, the theme vowels, and the endings for the imperfects of derived stems. That includes everything from the nafal and to the right. Note that the properties we are highlighting here are for strong verbs, but these are extremely important to learn because weak verbs usually have some strong characteristics. That is, even when verb forms have gutturals or other weak letters that affect some of these characteristics that we've been talking about, some part of the form almost always acts strong. That is, it matches what it would be in a strong verb. So when looking at any verb form, recognizing what you can of these characteristics is very important. So for example, kal and nifal imperfect, first common singular, will usually have the aleph with sagol as prefix and prefix vowel, even if changes occur in other characteristics such as theme vowel. So in this example, identifying the prefix and prefix vowel allows us to focus on kal or nifal. Let's look first at the nifal stem. Nifal imperfects, other than the first common singular, have prefix vowel hirik, which is the same as for the kal. Now the normal nun prefix for the nifal is assimilated, and the R1 letter is doubled in the imperfects. Thus, when we come to the R1 letter, we immediately can tell nifal from kal, because for the nifal imperfect, the R1 letter has a dagesh forte, and secondly, the R1 vowel is different also. It's comets. The kal imperfect, by contrast, has no R1 doubling, and the R1 has a silent schwa. So the nifal has a doubled R1 letter and an R1 vowel of comets. The theme vowel for the nifal imperfect is tsere. Remember the E from the A/E formula. The E stands for an E-class vowel in the imperfects. The imperfect suffixes are the same as we learned for the kal form. Where we see vocalic endings, that is for the second feminine singular, the second masculine plural, and the third masculine plural, the theme vowel reduces. Where we see a consonantal ending, and for the imperfects the only consonantal ending is for the second feminine plural and third feminine plural, the na, Because this is a light consonantal ending, that is a consonant and a vowel, the accent recedes to the second to last syllable, and we get tipakadna. Note that unlike most other imperfects in the derived stems, these relatively uncommon feminine plural forms have a patach as theme vowel. But normally these forms can be identified by the box characteristics and the imperfect suffix. Now let's look at the PL and the PUAL imperfects. Both have a prefix vowel of vocal schwa. It is at the R1 vowel that we can tell these stems apart. The PL has an R1 vowel of patach, and the PUAL has an R1 vowel of kibbutz. Now the PL is far more common than the relatively rare PUAL, but the PUAL, when it does occur, is very easy to identify because of the kibbutz, which is a vowel you don't see very often among the verb forms. Finally, both PL and PUAL have the characteristic doubled R2 through all the imperfects. The theme vowel for PL imperfects is tsere. As can be seen from our theme vowel formula, it is E-class. And for the PUAL, the theme vowel for imperfects is patach. Like all of the other stems except for hiphil, when a vocalic ending is added, the theme vowel reduces to a vocal schwa. Remember, when the theme vowel reduces for a PL or PUAL and becomes a vocal schwa, for some letters the dagesh forte may be left out of R2. Let's quickly review that. If you remember, there's a certain set of letters that if they have a vocal schwa and they're doubled, they may not show the dagesh forte. We call these the Schiemann-Levy letters, and the S refers to the set of sibilants right here, samek, tzade, sin, and shin, and then the Q, M, N, L, V, Y refer to one letter each, kof, mem, nun, lamed, vav, and yod. So if one of these letters, these so-called Schiemann-Levy letters, is supported by a vocal schwa and it's doubled, we may see the dagesh forte drop out. This is variable. So here's a couple of examples. Here is the verb yechalalu from Psalm 74:21. Note that even though this is a PL, it is a PL imperfect, third masculine plural. The lamed R2 letter has no dagesh forte because it is one of these Schiemann-Levy letters. But notice here in Job 21:11, we have the root shalach. We have also a PL imperfect, third masculine plural. We have yeshalachu. Notice that this lamed has a dagesh forte. The rule is if we have a Schiemann-Levy letter and it has a vocal schwa and it would take a dagesh forte, the dagesh forte may be omitted, but it may also be there. So we need to keep that in mind when we're parsing. Notice that even though the doubled R2 doesn't show up to help us, we do have the vocal schwa as the prefix vowel. We have the R1 vowel as patach. This is going to help us as we try to parse this as a PL. Okay, let's return back to the PLs and the PUALs. As with all the stems, the imperfect suffixes for PL and PUAL match the cal. All right, let's move on to the hithpael. The hithpael is the only stem that has two-letter prefixes for imperfects. In addition to our normal prefix letters, aleph, yod, tav, nun, the prefixes all have an additional tav as a second letter of a prefix. The first vowel is hirik, and the tav has a silent schwa, except for the first common singular where the aleph takes a sagol. Thus we have et, yit, tit, and nit. The R1 vowel, as with the PL, is patach, and the theme vowel is tsere, except where it reduces for a vocalic suffix, the second feminine singular, second masculine plural, and third masculine plural. Now looking at the Hiphil imperfect has a prefix vowel of patach. That's going to be very important. The R1 vowel is silent schwa, which technically isn't a vowel, but I just call it the R1 vowel for convenience. As with the perfects, forms with no endings or vocalic endings have hieroch yod as their theme vowel. This includes all cases except the feminine plurals, the second and third feminine plural, whose theme vowel is tsere. This makes Hiphil imperfects friendly to parse because most of them have the characteristic Hiphil theme vowel of hieroch yod. Note that for the Hiphil, the theme vowels do not reduce, except rarely for a few weak verbs, even when there are vocalic endings. So, for the third masculine plural, for example, we have yafkidu. Notice that the theme vowel is a hieroch yod, it does not reduce. Here the accent recedes, we have yafkidu, but this is not important now. Finally, the hofal. The imperfect for the rare hofal stem is pretty easy to spot because of the kametz hatuf prefix vowel, the silent schwa with R1, and the consistently A-class theme vowel. And of course, both the Hiphil and the hofal, like all the stems, have the same imperfect suffixes as you already learned with the cal. Having looked at the main characteristics of verbs, let's review what we need to look at to parse an imperfect. Normally, the box characteristics plus the imperfect suffix, along with possible help from the theme vowel, give us enough information to parse a form. Once we recognize that we have an imperfect prefix, the first thing we do is use the box characteristics to determine the stem. The prefix letter now narrows our choices within that stem. Aleph prefix indicates first common singular, nun means first common plural, a yod indicates third masculine, either singular or plural, and a tav tells us any of the second person forms or a third feminine singular. Finally, the imperfect suffix, or lack of one, and help or at least confirmation from the theme vowel gives us our final result. We'll look at some examples soon, but first, let's look at the rows just below the imperfects to see some forms that are very similar to imperfects, but with a few differences in places. We are going to look at the three rows underneath the imperfects, the vayiktol, the jussive, and the cohortative. Since on this chart we only have room for one row for each of these types, let's switch over to a different chart so that we can look at them in more detail. So we expand the rows out a little, and the first category we will look at is the vayiktol, or vav consecutive imperfect. The name vayiktol, also called wayiktol in some grammars, comes from the paradigm root katal, and this is how we pronounce the vav consecutive imperfect of katal, vayiktol. As we have already learned, the vav consecutive imperfect is constructed using a vav with a patach instead of the usual vocal schwa that goes with a vav. Then the prefix letter of the imperfect form is doubled, that is, it has a dagesh forte. The vav consecutive imperfect can occur for any of the imperfect forms. I have listed 4 here, but all the rest of the imperfect forms can be vav consecutive imperfect. For instance, first common singular, third masculine plural, third feminine plural, etc. In all the stems except the Hiphil and a few weak verbs, the vav consecutive imperfect looks exactly like the corresponding imperfect except for the doubled prefix letter. For example, a nifal third masculine plural vav consecutive imperfect is constructed from a normal nifal imperfect third masculine plural. For a few of the weak verb forms, we will see vav consecutive imperfects that look different than their imperfect counterparts, but we do not need to worry about these for a little while. There's one important point about piel and pual imperfects when we have a yod prefix. Because the prefix vowel is vocal schwa, when the normal doubling occurs, that is adding a dagesh forte to the prefix, often the dagesh forte is omitted. This is because, again, we have a schema Levi letter with a vocal schwa, and so it may omit the Dagesh forte. And for PL Vav consecutive imperfects with yod prefixes, the Dagesh forte is often left out. Note the doubling we see for the Tav prefix. This is not a Scheme Levi letter, and so the Dagesh forte is written. Now, as often happens, the Hifil is our renegade stem, and it has an exception to this rule for the Vav consecutive imperfects. The 3ms, and often for other forms as well, is written differently than the corresponding imperfect. Note for the third masculine singular, the theme vowel is tsere. Other forms can alternate between hirik yod or tsere as the theme vowel in the Vav consecutive imperfect forms, and sometimes you'll see the hirik yod written defectively as just hirik. Note that the prefix vowel of patach and the silent shua with R1 points to hifil. Just as with the hifil imperfects, you will not see the theme vowel reducing even when there's vocalic suffixes. For instance, for the second feminine singular. So note that despite these changes to the theme vowel, the prefix vowel is patach, and this would usually enable us to see that this is a hifil form. Now moving on to the jussives. The jussive is normally a third-person form, and it means let him do something, or let her, or let them, depending on the person and gender of the form. For most stems, the jussive is identical to its corresponding imperfect third-person form. Thus, for example, the PL imperfect third masculine singular is yifaked, and the jussive third masculine singular of the PL is identical. Similarly, the PL imperfect third feminine singular is identical to the PL jussive third feminine singular. For the hifil jussive third masculine singular, however, note that the theme vowel changes from hirik yod to tsere, and this change often occurs for other forms besides the third masculine singular as well, for example, the third feminine singular form. Again, the patach prefix vowel should alert us that this is likely a hifil, even though the theme vowel changes. Finally, in this section of imperfect-like forms, we look at the cohortative. The cohortative is a first-person form, either singular or plural, meaning let me or let us do something. It is formed by adding a vocalic comets plus hey to the end of a first-person imperfect form. The vocalic ending causes the theme vowel to reduce, except for the hifil form, where the theme vowel remains hirik yod. Remember, the hifil theme vowels almost never reduce. Let's look at some parsing examples now. Our first example is teshamari. Teshamari. So we look at the prefix and prefix vowel. The prefix vowel is a hirik. That tells us that we have a kal or a nifal. And we look at the R1, it's doubled, and we see the R1 vowel of comets, and that eliminates kal. So we have a nifal, imperfect. The prefix itself is a tav, so that tells us that we have anything of second person, or possibly a 3FS. And R2 doubling is not a factor here. Our theme vowel has reduced. We don't need to worry about that. And our imperfect suffix is a hirik yod, which matches second feminine singular. And so we have a nifal imperfect second feminine singular. Our root is shamar, and this would mean you, feminine singular, will be kept. The nifal has the passive meaning. Let's look at example 2 here. We have yaktilu. Yaktilu. So our prefix and prefix vowel, we have a yod with a patach. The patach is pointing to a hifil, and the silent shua confirms that as the R1. And there's no R1 doubling. That's not really a factor for anything except the nifal normally. R2 doubling is not an issue here. The theme vowel is a hirik yod. We saw that coming in, and that confirms hiphil. Then we look at the imperfect suffix. That is a shurik. The yod prefix tells us we have third masculine something, singular or plural, and the imperfect suffix confirms that as third masculine plural. So we have a hiphil imperfect, third masculine plural. Our root is katal, and I don't believe katal actually has a form in the hiphil, but if it did, it would mean they will cause to kill. All right, let's move on. Okay, example 3, we have nitpalel. Nitpalel. It's always important to try to figure out what the root is. It looks like our root here is palal. That would make our prefix 2 letters, nit, which immediately points to a hithpael. So our prefix and prefix vowel here indicate hithpael. Our R1 vowel is patach, and that matches hithpael. And we don't have R1 doubling. This is in fact a dagesh leni. It's coming after a silent schwa, and it's a bagad kafat letter. So R1 doubling is not a factor. R2 doubling, however, we do see, and that is what we would expect for a hithpael because that is an intensive stem. Our theme vowel is a tsere, which we expect for a hithpael imperfect, the AE form. There's our E. And then our imperfect suffix, there is none, which we'd expect when we have a nun prefix. A nun indicates imperfect first common plural, and our root is palal. And in the hithpael, palal means to pray, and so our translation here is we will pray. We will pray. Okay, let's look at example 4. Bring this up a little bit. We have nilkad. Nilkad. It looks like our root is lakad. This is where vocabulary also helps us. There is a root, lakad, means to capture. So our prefix and prefix vowel is a nun with a hirik. We'll try that out, and it seems to be, and it should work out for us. So the nun with a hirik, that would tell us nafal perfect, potentially. We could be looking at a kal imperfect, first common plural with that nun with the hirik prefix, or possibly a nafal imperfect, first common plural, because a nafal imperfect would also have a nun with a hirik for a first common plural. So let's see what else we find here. Well, the R1 vowel and R1 doubling, the R1 vowel here is a silent schwa, which rules out nafal imperfect because it would have a doubled R1 with a comets. So we're looking at either nafal perfect or kal imperfect. We now check R2 doubling, and this is not a doubled letter. This is a bagad kafat letter with a dagesh leni, so there's no doubling here. The theme vowel is patach. For a kal imperfect, we would expect to see a holum. We'd expect nilkod. There is no suffix, either imperfect or perfect suffix. And so, most likely we're looking at a nafal perfect 3ms. So here's a case where a nun with hirik prefix and R1 with silent schwa can cause confusion between a kal imperfect first common plural and a nafal perfect third masculine singular. And there will be cases, for instance, for the root shalach, where we have nishlach, and that theme vowel of patach will be the same for both kal imperfect first common plural and a nafal perfect 3ms, because the guttural letter in the R3 position forces this theme vowel to be an A-class vowel. And so here's a case where only context can tell these two apart. For lakad, however, we can be pretty sure that we have a foul perfect 3ms, and the meaning here would be he was captured. Okay, let's work on one more here. We'll come down to example 5. We have talamadu. Talamadu. Our prefix and prefix vowel, the vocal schwa points to pial or pual. The R1 vowel being patach confirms pial. We can eliminate pual. There is no R1 doubling. That's not a factor for pials typically. And we also notice that there is R2 doubling, which we would expect for a pial. Note here that because this is a schema-Levy letter and it did reduce down to a vocal schwa, the Digress forte could have been left out. It wasn't in this case, so we have the help of knowing that this R2 doubling is confirming that we have a PL. The theme vowel reduced to a vocal schwa, and the imperfect suffix here is a shurik. Together with the prefix of a tav, the tav tells us second person, possibly 3fs, but the shurik tells us masculine plural. So we have a pial imperfect, second masculine plural. Our root is lamad. In the cal that means to learn, in the pl it means to teach. And so we have you, masculine plural, will teach. Okay, the secret to parsing is to work many examples. So work examples on your own, and with practice you should get much better at parsing.